The thoughts, views, opinions, and testimonials shared by the host and guests of this podcast are for faith promoting purposes only. Latter day Stories does not represent the official position of The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter day Saints. This episode with Gregg was done over a year ago. The timelines are no longer accurate, but there is excellent news. He will mention how his father is a quote unquote dry member, but that is no longer the case. After many, many, many years, he has finally entered the waters of baptism this year in 2024. They are now aiming for their family to be sealed. Enjoy the episode. All right, what's up, everyone, and welcome to Latter Day Testimony, a LDS-based podcast focused on faith building, testimony bearing, and conversion sharing. I'm your host, known by the Twitter handle at BlackBlessedLDS, and our guest today is Gregg. And he is going to be sharing his story with us in regards to his faith journey, his testimony, and kind of where he's at today. So I wanted to turn the time over to Gregg to thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you.
And just to kind of let us know, if you've been a member your whole life, what your favorite LDS doctrine is, why you want to share this with us, and then we'll kind of go forward from there.
All right. My name is Gregg. I've been a member all my life. My mom's family have been members almost since the beginning of the Restoration, so very early
Nice.
on in the church's history. But I grew up in a part member household. My father isn't a member.
Hmm.
My favorite doctrine, I think it's easier to share my favorite scripture,
Okay.
which is John 6, 66 through 68. Let me go ahead and pull that up. It's
Yeah.
where Jesus had been teaching, and then it said, from that time forward, from that time, many of his disciples went back and walked no more with him. And then Jesus said unto the 12, will ye also go away? Then Simon Peter answered him, Lord, to whom shall we go? I think that's my favorite scripture. Just kind of encapsulates my own personal belief and relation to God. There isn't really anything else to it. If it's true, then it's true all the way, and you have to just kind of work yourself within the framework
Mm.
of the gospel. So that's my favorite on that one.
Oh yeah,
What I
I
want
like
to
that.
share with everyone today, I guess I feel like for me, it feels selfish to have been through the experiences I did and to have God bless me the way I did, and then just kind of keep it to myself. I don't like talking about being gay, but I also feel like God didn't give me this and help me through it just so I could
Mm.
selfishly keep all of that to myself. I would like to share with other people and hopefully help them as well.
Awesome. That's beautiful. I appreciate you coming on and being willing to do this. So yeah, I definitely want to just pass it over to you to kind of start your story. But before I guess kind of get into that, I grew up in an apartment home for about 12 years or so. My father wasn't a member, and my mom was being reactivated at the time. What was that like for you growing up in an apartment member home?
Um, I don't know. My dad was always very supportive. It almost
Mm.
was like uh what they call a dry member, someone
Mm.
who like he doesn't even drink coffee or anything.
Oh, okay.
Doesn't, swear, doesn't drink alcohol or anything like that. So it was almost kind of like having a member for dad. I missed out on a lot of the experiences of having your parents be endowed or having
Hmm.
your dad be a priesthood holder.
Yeah.
So those weren't things I grew up with, and they're not things that a lot of people in the church, they kind of take for granted to ask like their dad for a blessing
Yeah.
or to have grow up with their parents, I guess, wearing garments, which my mom didn't get endowed until my brother went on his mission.
Okay.
Um, so I didn't grow up with those things that people just think of as culturally
Mm.
normal. That's really the only major difference. Again, like I said, he was always very supportive of us going to church and going to seminary, going on missions, and things like that. And he reads with my mom and I when we read the scriptures.
Okay.
He reads them with us every day. So
That's cool. That's awesome. Was there any other point in your life you thought he was getting close or not really?
um he just kind of stays about the same spot.
Okay.
Uh like I think right now is probably the closest he's been, just
Hmm.
because he does go to church with us when we go.
Okay,
Um, yeah.
cool. No, yeah, I get that. I mean, I remember my dad got baptized in time to um, baptize my youngest sister. And I remember just being like, oh, I wish I got baptized by my dad. And, like you said, some of the things that people miss out that they don't realize. Um, but yeah, I totally get that. That's awesome though. And I'm glad that he's super supportive. It sounds like he's an awesome dad. Um, but yeah, with that said, feel free just to kind of dive in and let us know about yourself and your story.
Hmm. So I just kind of wanted to talk about so I'm gay and the my journey in the church and what that's kind of been like. A lot of my gay peers say they like always knew they were gay, and
Hmm.
while I understand like kind of where they're coming from with that, I don't think uh that's anything more than like rooted in stereotypes, like, oh, I liked these things or I liked that thing. To me, it just kind of it requires one to have a sexuality in order to be a homosexual.
Okay.
And so for me, it didn't really manifest as far as I was concerned until I was in puberty and started feeling sexually attracted to other men. Um, I adapted pretty fast. I'm not someone who is prone to self-deceptions.
Hmm.
So for me, I just accepted it like right off the bat. I've known people who they're like, "Oh man, I was like after my mission till I realized, till I could admit to myself, and I it's not something I understand."
Okay, gotcha.
So for me, like it's just something that it's there, and I just accepted it. I talked to my bishop. So that was a real formative experience. When I was like 14, I went to go talk to my bishop, and he was pretty chill about it. He's just like, okay, I don't know a lot about this, so let me, break out the bishop's handbook, and he looked in that while we were sitting there awkwardly while I was
Awkward
reading.
silence.
Yeah, awkward silence while he read up on that, and then he's like, okay, it just says, as long as you don't act on it, you can go forward like any other saint, and that was just kind of it. Uh, it feels anticlimactic, but like to him it wasn't a big deal. It's not. It's just that's just what it is, and so that's all the more there is to say about it. And some people might feel kind of insulted by that, like, oh well, he's kind of treating it blasé. But for me, that
Hmm.
was perfect. Just kind of it made me feel normal. Like I'm like anyone else.
Yeah.
Um, so that was a foundation. That's kind of where it started, and that kind of set the tone for a lot of where I went from there.
Do you feel like after you let him know, did you feel future communications or anything that just kind of felt like, I don't know, he was insinuating things in a way? Did you ever feel different from it or get anything different from him, or was he always just pretty supportive and you didn't really feel left out in any way just because he knew your sexuality?
No, I didn't feel like he treated me any differently. And I've continued to have experiences with him for years after that. I wasn't in his ward for much longer. The wards split
Hmm.
shortly after that, and I was in a different ward. But he became part of the stake presidency
Mm,
shortly after, and so I had him in the stake presidency. And then when I was in the YSA, quite a bit later, he was in the YSA bishopric. And he's always just treated me just like anyone else, and I've always
cool.
really appreciated that.
Yeah, that helps. That's awesome.
That's like I said, that's the foundation everything kind of got built on.
Hmm.
From there, I kind of you go into high school, and everyone's kind of uh, going their own way, and I don't really know. I didn't really know what to do with this. I had this foundation of the church is true, but I'm attracted to guys, and those two things don't merge very well.
Yeah.
So I just kind of I decided that once I got out of high school, I would put the gospel on the shelf until I could figure out what to do with the side of me that was attracted to guys.
Okay.
And life had other plans. So right after I graduated, I was struck pretty hard with depression. I'd moved almost right after I graduated to go up to the college town where I was going to go to college and try and get a job over the summer up there, and then go to college that fall. But the depression was very heavy. Both my siblings had gotten married. My life changed so fast.
Hmm.
It was like running into a brick wall. And so I moved back home before the end of the summer and transferred to a college near where I lived to go to school there. which is good. I was in kind of, a more structured setting, and it kept me from putting the gospel on the shelf and coming back to it later. As I was with my parents, I couldn't run around and experiment, as they say. So I'm still feeling this dichotomy, though, even though I can't act on it, or I could, but I was in a setting where that would be more difficult. And so I'm still, I was experiencing depression. It wasn't really caused by that, though. Like, my
Okay.
depression was from life turning upside down. But once I got on medication, my emotional keel evened out, but I was still left with that dichotomy.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it kind of felt like God grew weary of my whinings. But fortunately, he took pity on me and kind of put me in my place a little bit. I was kind of just sitting there, just like, oh, I really want a boyfriend.
Yeah.
Like, you can go get one. And I'm like, well, no, that would be a sin. And he's like, correct, it would be a sin. And I'm like, but I want one. He's like, okay, you have the agency to go get one. And I'm like, what? And he's like, you have agency and you're foregoing all of it because you feel like you're stuck in a stasis where you can't act, but you can act. You have agency and you're foregoing all of it. You're not making any decisions. You're not choosing the gospel
Mm-hmm.
and you're not choosing to not sin. You're just in a place where you're not, but you're
Just
not
stagnant.
making choices. You're just drifting and you can't drift into the celestial kingdom.
Mm.
You have to choose righteousness to actually to make it into the celestial kingdom. You can't just drift in. And I'm like,
Yeah.
oh my goodness, you know.
Was this all
uh,
like in one moment, or was this over some like period of time?
no, this was like one moment. I'm sitting there in the
Okay.
lunch at the institute building for the college where I was going,
Okay.
and he just kind of smacked me upside the head and was like, "Hey, understand."
So you felt like he mostly was upset that you just weren't making a decision.
Yes, I wasn't choosing the gospel. And at the moment I was like wanting something, and I'm like, "Oh, I can't." And he's like, "Yes, you can. You can choose that. You have
Mm.
that agency. It would be a sin to
Interesting.
choose it, correct? But you have the agency to make that choice, to head that direction, to make the wrong choice.
Mm-hmm.
And you're not choosing to not do it. You're just foregoing any decision making at all.
Gotcha.
And part of our purpose here in this world is to exercise our agency to choose righteousness so that
Mm.
we grow as people. You don't grow when you just let life circumstances make all your decisions for you. You may as well just be a rock out in the field because all its decisions are made for it as well. It doesn't have the agency to move and to act. I
Yeah.
was allowing the world to act upon myself instead of being an agent to act for myself.
Mm.
But because it's like, but I wasn't choosing the gospel. And so you don't get blessings when you don't choose to do what's right and you just do it because that's all you've ever known.
Mm.
He
Yeah.
wanted me to exercise my agency, to choose righteousness over sin. So from there, which was a really cool moment, and then I chose, at that point, I chose to live the gospel. I'm like, this is the choice I want to make. I want to
Okay.
live the gospel, and it's going to take trials and all those things. But I know it's true. I've never had to have a major sit down moment where, I really prayed hard to know whether or not the gospel was true. I know some people have said that's something they've had to do is wrestle with God to get a testimony. It's not something I've ever had to wrestle with.
Mm-hmm.
That was a gift of the Spirit that I was given, and one that my sister shares. We have this rich culture, rich heritage on my mom's side of being members of the church pioneer
Mm-hmm.
ancestry. It's just, and so I grew up with these stories of like my ancestor Marie Jensen, who was a convert from Denmark during the pioneer times, and she and her fiance converted, and there was an elderly widow who also converted, and they were going to come over to America to go to Utah, and she gets to the dock the day they're supposed to leave, and her fiance just doesn't show up,
Mm.
just abandons her. And so she gets to cross the ocean and then the entire United States to Utah as a single woman in the 1800s.
Dang.
Um, and so that was just, but she did it because the gospel was true.
Mm-hmm.
And so those are the kind of stories I grew up with. The other story that comes to mind that was really inspirational for me and was a little more applicable to my circumstances was my great uncle Pete. So during World War II, he was in the Pacific and he got captured very early on in World War II by the Japanese, very early into the war. And
Okay.
he spent the entire remainder of the war, like 3.5 years, in a Japanese prison camp. And he was tortured, and he lost all feeling from his waist down.
Oh man.
So he could never have kids. He did manage to teach himself how to walk again, but when he got out of the prison camp, when they were liberated, and he returned to the hospital and got out of the hospital, they asked him how he felt about the Japanese, and he didn't hold any malice towards them. He had been stationed in Hawaii at the beginning of the war, so he'd known Japanese beforehand. So to him, it's like, why would I hate a whole people because of this thing that was largely orchestrated by their government and how they kept them.
Yeah.
He wanted to go to Japan and teach the people there the gospel. And at first, Japan wasn't open to foreign missionaries, but he was sent to Hawaii to serve a service mission in Hawaii, and they have a lot of Japanese people in Hawaii, and he
Yeah.
was able to work there. And then eventually, when Japan didn't open up to foreign missionaries, they sent him to help establish the church in Japan, and he served there for many years.
Dang.
But he never got married. But he served the Lord and his fellow man, and so that was an example for me because I know being a member of the church who experiences same-sex attraction, uh, the prospect of marriage is a lot lower.
Yeah.
I'm not like I don't feel the desire to get married in this life. I'm willing to accept what God throws my way, but that's not something I feel for myself at this moment.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the idea of being single in the church, a lot of people talk about how that's like unrealistic, and they don't ask straight members to do that, and they do. If you don't get married, you stay single and celibate. And my uncle was an example of this. I grew up with stories about this man
Hmm.
and how he served his fellow man. You don't have to be a nobody in the church if you don't get married. You can serve
Yeah. Paul
your
thought the
whole
same thing,
life.
right? Like
Yeah.
he
Sorry, say that
just,
again.
I said Paul thought the same thing, right? He was like, it's better to, he said, if you only get married if you can't withhold your urges, basically.
Yep.
But if you can, he thought it was better to just be celibate and, do work and whatnot. Um, but yeah, but at the same time, like for me, like, I don't know, is that an idea that's still like hard for you sometimes?
It depends. It depends sometimes on the time of year. I do experience seasonal depression, and sometimes depression brings a desire for companionship out.
Yeah.
My depression isn't centered at all um, on the being gay at all for
Hmm.
me. I know it is for a lot of people.
Yeah.
That's never been what's triggered my depression for me.
Okay.
I really longed for that life before both my siblings got married and my life turned upside down, like the simplicity of when I was younger, um, and things like that. But for me, depression can make it harder to handle difficult things in your life.
Hmm.
So there are times where I wish for a companion, but I also know that just even if I chose to change my life, one's not going to just fall out of the sky and into my lap. It
Yeah.
would still be hard and it would still bring trials. And that's one of the things I think is really good to remember. And I talked about this in a lesson I just gave yesterday. I'm an elders quorum teacher, and that all life choices bring difficulties and blessings, and
Hmm.
you're not going to get life perfect if I just make this choice. It's the grass is greener on the other side of the fence kind of false notion.
Yeah.
And so I know if I made that choice to go get a boyfriend, that it would bring difficulties and challenges of its own. And I would rather have the difficulties and challenges I've always had and stay in the gospel where I know that because I know the gospel is true, than make the decision to leave and try and pursue a relationship with another man.
Hmm. Okay. Something that popped into my mind, um, and because I saw some people like fighting over this on Twitter a couple of days ago. So we see it. I see a trend on online at least. I don't know how vocal people are in real life, but online there are people who are obviously they put that they're LGBTQ allies, and there's those who feel like when you are or you broadcast that you're going against the church's teachings. And so it's usually very like what people would say progressive versus those who are very just like conservative in regards to the gospel and the church. Um, what are your thoughts on that? And do you think someone who's a member of the church that does believe the doctrine of families can truly be an ally? Does that make sense? Like,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? So I was curious what your thoughts were on that.
I think they can. I don't like the term ally. It bothers
Okay.
me. I just
Okay.
because it comes with a lot of baggage socially.
Hmm.
And I don't it usually involves like plastering the pride flag on your profile or in your yard. And I really don't like pride, the celebration or the pride flag. They have a lot of history to them, and a lot of context that I dislike. I like the tone that was set for me by my bishop. I'm I can go forward like any other saint. I want to be treated as a person
Yeah.
and not a category of person. I want to just be a whole person. When people ask me what I identify as, my answer is Gregg. My identity is Gregg. It
Yeah.
comes with an entire list and combination of attributes that you cannot categorize with anything other than my name. Do I think you can be an ally? I think you can. I mean, even in the greater social context of that.
Yeah.
I probably would heavily disagree with you politically and socially on a lot of things, but I still think you can love your savior and wish the best for other people.
Yeah.
I would still argue about the outcomes that are coming from that and various political things around it.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah.
Um, for me, what would be the best ally would be to treat me as a person, as Gregg, as me. And I will talk about being gay and
Hmm.
a member of the church occasionally. I've mentioned it in lessons. I try not to belabor the point just because I find it irritating when other people do that. So I don't
Yeah.
want to do that, but it is part of the refiner's fire that helped form me to who I am.
Yeah.
Um, but I still try not to make it like a central identity point because I don't want it to be a centralized identity point. Um, so
Yeah.
yeah,
No.
for me, the best thing to be an ally would be for to me would to just be to support me as a person, as an individual, and not as an identity that you just kind of vaguely prop up.
Yeah. Okay. I actually like that. That makes total sense. And I would say I probably agree with every point you made there as much as I can for someone who doesn't really know your point of view and your perspective. But based on what you explained, that all makes perfect sense to me. Um, so something that happened to me, I think earlier today, and I'm curious to see what your thoughts are from your perspective. So I had someone message me randomly asking me if I why I thought Jesus was white. Um, and you see my profile picture. It's like
Yeah.
Middle Eastern type looking Jesus. I don't know what Jesus looks like. Obviously, never seen him. I just like that picture a lot, and I would tend to believe that he was probably more of the. I don't even think he was black, but just like of the browner side than he was of a whiter side. I could be wrong. We'll find out one day, I guess. But my response to him was, well, have you seen my profile picture? Like, I feel like that's kind of a dead giveaway. Um, and he completely changed the subject and went into me being black and in this white church, basically, and then called me a coon. Um,
Oof.
and for me, it's like, it's whatever. But for what I've noticed, though, is that there are um, black people who get upset when some other black members wipe under the rug the history of the church and things of that nature. And because I guess some members would use people like me and others as examples of, hey, get over it. And so, have you seen that in yourselves with the LGBTQ community where they're like frustrated that you're able to just like kind of put that on the shelf because you put the gospel first, because maybe some people will try and use you as like their tool of, yeah, well, see, you can do this, you can do that. You guys are just choosing not to, and kind of using that as an attack to them. Does that concern you that that's could be done, or you heard or
I
heard
haven't
people talk
heard it
about
as
that?
much for me. That's usually an argument that gets leveled at the ones who get married to someone of the opposite sex.
Okay, okay.
People feel like they're flaunting their story,
Mm,
and that others will use it to pound other people
yeah,
into the ground. You know, hey, you have to be like this. I think that's a concern. I think, but you could say that about anything. You know, oh, being telling your story
hmm,
automatically doesn't mean that everyone else has to be that same way. And
yeah,
it feels like they're almost trying to like silence you by saying, no, you can't tell your story because someone might misuse it.
yeah,
But
yeah.
you can't just not do things because someone else might misuse what you said or what you did.
True. Yeah,
You can try and mitigate it as much as possible, but I also feel like it's unfair to always say this group always has to clarify that it's their story, but this other group doesn't. I feel like
yeah,
that's something I've seen a lot where members who do get married to someone of the opposite sex always have to frame their story as this is just mine. No one else has to live this way.
yeah,
But if the second someone leaves, it's like, no, 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 no one can accomplish it. You all have to be like me and leave the church. It's
yeah.
like there's
That's fair.
there's this
Yeah,
double standard that drives me out of my mind. And I am, as they say, subtweeting, or what is that? Where like you're trying to reference someone,
yeah,
I
yeah,
but
yeah.
not actually say their name.
You
There
don't
is
at
someone
them.
specifically that is a reference to that I was very frustrated by when
Oh,
that
okay.
happened with them. I don't want to. I'm not going to name names because I don't
Yeah,
want to
you're
call the
good.
person out at all. But it was something that did specifically happen, and I was very frustrated by it when I saw that. I do think there is something to say, you know, where it is like your story can be misused, but I also feel like that's something you can't just be afraid of
Yeah,
that, you know, oh, your story might be misused because that could be true of anyone's story.
that's fair. I appreciate you saying that because that actually helps me a lot as well. Because I still feel that way sometimes. Where just even just like getting the podcast started, it was like, well, if I tell my story about why I stayed, because my faith crisis started with race in the priesthood, um, and so if I tell my story about why I stayed, then people could use that as, well, get over it because I know a black dude who, whatever. And I don't want that. But I do want people who maybe are in my shoes that want to stay to see that there is a way to stay and still love the church and acknowledging doctrines, past disavowed teachings, things of that nature. So I'm glad you said that actually helps me a lot as well. So I appreciate that. Um, has there ever been a point um, in your life, because you said that you basically decided to pick the gospel, um, has there ever been a point in life where you've regretted it or you still like fight with that sometimes? I know, like for me, sometimes every once in a while there's a new struggle that comes up and I'm like motivating myself or reminding myself of my spiritual experiences and why. Do you experience that as well?
Um, Not in regards to whether or not the gospel is true or whether I should live
Hmm.
it. Whether I struggle to align my behaviors with that belief, but I've never struggled with whether or not I made the right choice because,
Okay.
like I said, I've just always had the spiritual gift of a testimony. So I've
Hmm.
never questioned whether or not it was true. It's just a matter of how do I align myself with that truth. So no, and that's something that I've always has set me apart to some degree and why I struggle to actually relate to other members of the church who do experience same-sex attraction.
Okay.
Because my journey was so much different than theirs, I often get short-tempered with them. I find them frustrating in many ways because my experiences are so different and my
Yeah.
conclusions were so different. I have trouble relating to them. It's kind of funny. I almost feel like God made me like the straight person ambassador because I relate to them so much easier. And so like I get along with them a lot better. And so I'm like, I'm the person to get them used to that these other people exist.
Well, maybe that's I mean, we all have something to work on. So I mean, for you, I guess it might be trying to understand why they're struggling the way they are versus you who it seemed, I mean, I had an interview with someone else who also was gay. It does seem like your story is a lot more streamlined in regards to what you've decided, how you want to go about it, your revelatory experience that helped out. Whereas his was very much like wanted to, then this happened, then excommunication, and this, and like, all this other stuff. And yours is pretty straightforward. Um, so yeah, it sounds like you've had a pretty strong testimony of the gospel. You've never really doubted or wavered. The only real hard thing that you had to do was figure out if your sexuality was more important than your testimony in the gospel.
That's exactly it. And just like I said, aligning that knowledge with behavior and how to reconcile that and how to align that with the knowledge I had of the gospel and belief in its truthfulness, which isn't easy. And I'm not going to pretend it is easy or that it was
Yeah.
an easy journey. And there are certainly missteps along the way that I've made and things that I've struggled with. But the core element is the gospel is true and then aligning yourself with that and giving yourself space to make mistakes while doing that. But knowing, keeping your eye on the end goal, like they say, keep your eye fixed on the truth and God, and then your path will stay straight. I've done swimming. I really enjoy swimming, and when I'm doing the backstroke, which is my favorite, one of the ways I'm very right-handed, and so when my left side, I turn when I
Oh
swim,
yeah. Okay.
and when I'm doing the backstroke, and so one of the things that keeps me swimming straight is to look at the ceiling and make sure I'm looking at that, so that way my reach and my swim strokes keep me even.
Okay.
So keeping my eye fixed on that to stay on a straight path.
That's a awesome example. I always hear the ones of like, people like plowing and you're looking at the tree and whatnot, but I haven't heard that. So that's actually pretty cool.
I didn't think
Um
of it until just now, honestly. Like I've never put that together. I'm like, wait, that is very
that's
similar. It's
actually
kind of interesting how God can give you moments of clarity like that, even in
yeah,
random moments like this.
that's cool. That's cool. So it leads me back to like your scripture earlier, because I feel like
Hmm.
that really does tie into your experience of um what was it yeah, Simon Peter answering him, where shall I go, like where am I going to go, like you have the words for eternal life. And so for you it was like, hey, I know I have these two options, and I know you're telling me I have agency to choose, but essentially your moral agency, I heard President Bednar talking about that, is the gospel. And you're like, hey, like God is the way, the gospel is true, and one way or another this is going to get taken care of, and I just know that this is where I need to be. So that's cool that that's the scripture you use, because I feel like that does actually tie in very well um to your life and what you've gone through so far.
Yeah, it's definitely the one that encapsulates my beliefs and my own experiences. Like I said, having the spiritual gift of a testimony meant I always knew it was true, and then just what to do from there. And once I realized there really is nowhere else to go, like what else am I going to do with myself? Where else would I go when I know the gospel's true?
Hmm.
There is nothing else. If the gospel is true, then it is everything, and you have to live it all the way, or at least try. Obviously, he doesn't expect perfection, or there wouldn't have been the need for an atonement.
Hmm.
And you just live your life as strictly to the gospel as possible because it's not a partial thing. If it's true, then it's all true, and you have to just align yourself to that.
Man, yeah, I tell, I know, I'm sure all of us do, know some people who are in the LGBTQ community. And I don't know what it's like to be able to have a desire urge to be with someone and he can't. Um, but hearing your experience and how strong your testimony is to staying in the gospel is it's inspiring. That was the purpose of me wanting to do this is, I know or feel like my story will help someone, and I think your story will help someone. And we're gonna get as much love for our stories as we probably gonna get hate for our stories, especially from our own individual communities. But like you said, we can't be scared or quiet to share our stories, just because of half the people that are going to be upset, because it's probably going to help out someone who might be wondering, is there someone like me who is able to justify or reconcile with staying in the gospel? And I think your story will potentially be able to touch someone to do that. And we always hear, um, even if you just say one soul, how great will be your joy in our Father's kingdom. And that's kind of like what pushed me and motivated me. And so I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your story. And I hope if someone, is in the same situation you or knows someone that is, that they can reach out to you to, just to talk or to kind of get your viewpoint. Because like I said, we hear a lot of more of the negative side of stuff. And I want to be able to put out this positive side. Like, I think of it as like, everyone's going to come to a fork in the road one day. For me, it was race in the priesthood. Um, and at the time, I didn't have any Black friends, members that I could go to. So it kind of felt like I was doing it on my own. And I had to decide, am I done with this? Or am I going to lean into my faith and kind of look into things and make a decision for myself and whatnot? And I leaned into my faith, and obviously here I am today. But I know some people, when they get to that fork in the road and they start doing their own stuff, they're going to hear all the negative stuff. And so I want to be able to share some of this positive stuff. And, I think of it like a call center. Like, no one calls a call center to tell you how happy they are about everything. Like, you only hear from the customers who are upset, and it feels like everyone's upset, but really it's only 1% of the customers who are upset, but all you hear is it from them. And so I feel like that's the same thing within the church and the gospel as well. Is we hear so much negativity of why I left, what I found, all this other stuff. But we rarely hear the other side, either because people don't have an opportunity to share it, people don't know how to share it, or people are nervous to share it. And I hope them seeing your bravery and your story will be able to help them share theirs as well.
Thank you. Yeah, it's one of the reasons I started speaking out was I didn't want other people to set the narrative around what it's like to be a member of the church
Yeah.
while being gay.
Yeah.
And it just bothered me that they kept getting amplified so much when they've
Mm-hmm.
left. The media loves it. And I didn't want that to be the only story. And I felt like they got a disproportionate amount of the attention. But then if I don't tell my own story, I'm allowing that to happen.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of it ties back to the agency thing. What am I choosing to do, and how am I choosing to affect the world and interact with it to achieve what I think it should look like as much
Yeah.
as I can? Obviously, I don't control the whole world, but what am I doing to change things? What am I doing to interact with the world in order to make what I think it should look like happen?
Yeah, it's weird to think how much, even not doing anything makes something happen. And so
Yep.
you might as well do what you want to do, because one way or another, like you said, the world's gonna act on you, or it's gonna move on without you. So if you want to do or make any type of change, you might as well make a choice and go after it, versus just being lukewarm and just kind of,
Yep.
I guess, what we used to use in a word in the past, used to just like fence sitting, just like, oh, I'm
Yep.
not gonna pick either one. I'm just gonna kind of write it out. I mean, I think about, um like Layman and Lemuel. I was talking to someone, and it's like, it's weird to think, when you think about their journey, they really did do almost everything Nephi did. They went back to get the brass plates, they built the ship, they crossed the water. Like, they did everything Nephi did, but the difference is Nephi did it with faith, and they kind of just did it going through the motions, complaining, and just did it because they had to. Or every once in a while they had to be, an angel had to come down to them and say, hey, like, cut it out. This do it. And even right after Angel leaves, then they go back to murmuring, well, how are we going to
Oh,
do
I know.
this? Like, you know what I mean?
That
And
was the
so,
funniest thing. That was the funniest scripture to me because it's like the angel leaves and there's kind of like stupid angel.
yeah,
It's
I
like,
know.
what?
The
You
minute the
had an
Angel leaves, like,
angel
how are we going to
appear to
do this?
you.
I know. It's so weird. It's like, I feel like the minute, if I would assume, if I saw an angel and the minute Angel left, like, I would be like guns ablazing, like, let's go. We got this. I can do it. But the minute Angel left, they're like, well, he has so many, like an army of people. Like, how are we going to do this? And it's like, dude, the angel just told you God's going to prepare a way for you. Like, just go do it. Like,
It
it's
is,
so,
it is,
yeah,
it's
it's
so
funny.
funny. Laban can command 100. It's like,
Yeah.
what? God made the world.
For real. That's so
What
funny. Yeah.
what is 100 men, tiny little things on top of a massive planet, you know?
Yeah.
Even with their limited scope of knowledge about that, it's like,
Yeah.
no.
I know. But it just shows like just how just going through the motions, you can only go through the motions so long before you ultimately fall away or you need to make that decision. And I don't think everyone who's fallen away has just gone through the motions. I think some people like myself, I was on my mission and I was probably the peak of my spirituality when, I um hit that fork in the road. And so I think some people really do have concerns. They just don't know what to do, or they just can't reconcile with it. But for people who may or are currently on that same path and coming to that fork in the road, I hope your story, mine, and others will help them to see that there is a way past that to stay in the church and be happy and not just being just be in the church and going through the motions, but truly believing in the gospel and that this is God's gospel and that we might not have the answers for everything, but we will one day. And that's the part of the faith. I mean, that's some things I just can't answer. And at that point, it's just faith. Some people don't like that, but that's kind of the point of the whole process.
That's one thing I definitely learned when I was a history education major when I was in college, and one thing I
Okay.
learned about history with my extensive experience with it, which extends outside of college and just
Okay.
watching history all my life, is just you don't know. There's so much about history that you weren't there for. You don't know the context. I think of trials. We had the massive Johnny Depp trial, and there's still divided opinions about what happened. Who
Yeah.
was the actual abuser?
Even
How did
after
this
everything came
situation
out.
turn out?
Yeah.
Yeah, but we're supposed to be like, oh, well, we should know 100% what happened in this church historical event. And I'm like,
Mm.
how? We don't know what happened last week. You know?
That's
There's
true. I never
divided
thought of it like
opinions
that.
about what happened last week between two people, you know?
Yeah.
And I feel like we need to give, and there are things you can say objective, this is
Yeah.
wrong and this is wrong. But as far as like, did this happen? Did it happen this way? Is my framing of this situation accurate?
Hmm.
Um, I think we need to give some leeway. I mean, obviously, you can't just be like, oh, well, nothing in the past matters. But
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
do think, we maybe should judge the past a little easy because we weren't there. We don't know 100% what happened.
Hmm.
And we weren't in the person's mind,
Yeah.
especially. Because even if they wrote it down later, one of the things you learn is if it wasn't written down almost at the time of the event, like if it's 1 year, 2 years later, it's considered a secondary source as opposed to a primary source and
Mm.
has less validity because you've had an entire year to reframe everything that you experienced and to forget
Interesting.
stuff as well. And so the past is very hard to analyze because there's so much you don't know. And we can only say, this is what we understand.
Hmm.
And something new could come careening in out of nowhere and blow up the whole narrative. And you just will be like, okay, I didn't know that. I think we just giving the past a little bit of leeway and be like, I wasn't there. I don't want to judge it because I wasn't there. I'm not the person. I wasn't in the historical context that
Hmm.
it took place in. And there's so many factors that I don't understand. Um, and that's something I think we could do with all of history is kind of just give
Yeah.
a little bit of leeway, even if it's just
Yeah.
a little bit. I tend to try and just give it a lot of leeway and be like, I wasn't there. I don't want to judge it.
That brings up 2 points or thoughts. So for me, took me a little while before I told my story about like my faith crisis. Um, I don't even think I told my parents until like within the last year or two. I didn't wasn't trying to hide it or anything, or let them like I just didn't feel like I needed to because I had gotten
Yeah.
past it. Like it was years ago on my mission. Um, but the few times I have told it, I look back on it, and even when I tell it, sometimes I notice each time I tell something differently or something's added that I didn't mention in the previous one. And so if all these people wrote down what I said, though even just in the last year, there's probably inconsistencies of, well, he didn't say this, so is he making it up or did he just forget it? And all this other stuff. So I can't even imagine the context of like 200 years ago and example like Joe Smith being a teenage boy versus writing something 10, 5 years later, what have you. So that's something that came to my mind because I was talking to a family member who recently left, and I kind of gave that example. And I was like, hey, honestly, if people wrote down what I said about my conversion story, they'll probably think I'm making some stuff up. But really, it's because I remember some stuff in some points and others I forget. And I'm sure there might be some events that didn't happen as well as I remembered it a couple of years ago. Um, recently I saw something about similar like this. Have you heard the show New Amsterdam?
Yes.
Okay, have you watched it at all?
It was on a while back, wasn't it?
It's
New Amsterdam.
yeah, it's like a Grey's Anatomy. A lot,
Hmm.
but it's like only like 5 seasons. But there's an episode.
Okay, this is the one I was thinking of as a different one.
Oh, okay. So there's this episode where this doctor, she hated her dad her whole life because he left. And she remembered vividly how the accident, like what happened the day he left, all this other stuff. And she's talking to her friend who was a therapist, and she was recanting the story to him, and he did some research. He's like, hey, like it didn't rain that day, and it didn't this and it didn't that. And he's like, are you sure you remember the right place and what happened? And she's like, I remember I wanted him, and he ripped my beads got ripped when he pushed me away because he wanted to leave. And he's like, beads don't get ripped when you push someone, and usually when it gets pulled. And so like all these years, she thought she knew this, and she wrote the, how she recanted and whatnot, but it really didn't happen that way. And she realized, oh, like my dad wanted me, but my mom pulled me away. She kicked him out, and it wasn't at this location, and all this other stuff. So it's crazy how much things can change over time. And so, like you said, I give leeway when someone says, well, something was written and this is what was said. And what about this, and this? I'm like, that there's a lot of reasons why something could be missing or added or what have you. Like our brains, such an interesting thing, especially if it goes like you said, you don't write it the minute it happens. I don't care if you tell it a week later, it's probably gonna be different than what actually happened, let alone 200 years later.
Well, and just even my own story, there have been like, well, you didn't have this, you didn't bring up this thing. And even when I prepared it today, I took it from when I had told it to someone else,
Mm-hmm.
and I've changed how I've explained it.
Mm-hmm.
Not complete, like the theme is obviously still the same, but there's things I didn't bring up and all
Yeah,
sorts of
yeah,
stuff that it's like, well, you said it was really important to this, your foundational belief about yourself. And it's like, yeah, but like there's other things, and I wanted to focus on
yeah,
my audience and what I'm trying to convey with what I'm telling,
exactly.
you know. And that's why when Joseph sat down to write down his actual history, and why we often use that one, is because he was trying to remember as much as possible and
Mm-hmm.
to tell all of it instead of like, I'm speaking to this audience, so I'm going to focus on this element of it.
Mm-hmm.
Like
Yeah,
for this audience, I was going over a lot of my agency and why these things inspired me. And so there are some things that I didn't bring in, and just that's you look at your audience as well and what point you're trying to make by telling a story. And we
yeah.
do that sometimes with the Bible. A lot of the stories in the Old Testament are mythopoetic. Did they happen very strictly literally? Well,
Mm-hmm.
telling a story very strictly and literally was a concept that came in a lot later in our history, as opposed to telling it thematically.
Story.
And
Yeah.
some elements might be different. Some things might be, was the whole world flooded, or was the whole world
Where
in
they were
our whole
at.
world was
Oh,
flooded?
interesting. Yeah, yeah,
Our world was flooded as far as we knew.
yeah,
And I it's their idea of telling it very strictly and literally was not a concept culturally until much later, um, during more of the scientific revolution. Being very strict and literal, so that way you can
yeah.
perfectly understand what happened in the past. And so sometimes people get hung up on that in the Bible, and it's like, well, that's not what they were trying to say. And people get hung up defending the Bible in that manner as
Yeah,
well. It is 100% strict. It's like, well, is that what they would have thought of it as when telling it and writing it down? Where they have thought to write it down strictly literally? We see that with the story of Troy and its downfall. Like it took us years to believe that it was actually existed. But then when it did, it was like, oh, well, it's not quite how it was written down in the story. It's like, no, because the Greeks wrote it down as a mythopoetic story, not as a very strict, literal, this is what happened. And then obviously, Odysseus got lost on the way back on the islands and all these mystical events. Well, Troy still existed. The war still happened. It may not have happened as they wrote it down. And obviously, Odysseus didn't come back from that war and have all these wacky adventures with mystical beings, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen. It's kind of that idea. You're storytelling about the past and you build on elements, and that sometimes is misremembered and
yeah,
misspoken and all those things. And it's just that's how memories work. They don't work in a very specific sense. It's often the story and perspective you're seeing it from that you remember it as, and the story you wrote inside your head.
yeah. Man, that's great. That's so interesting. I'm kind of glad we got off on that because that's something I wanted to talk about and didn't know how, and somehow we just made it flow through. So
Yep.
I appreciate that. I think that's going to be a nice little nugget of knowledge that people will be able to receive, not just from your story, but then from this as well, especially with um, your schooling and your background. So that helps out a lot. Um, so just like to kind of wrap things up, if there is a way you wanted to summarize or something you wanted to say um, to those who listen, what do you think that you would want them to get from this episode and your story?
I would want them to know that the gospel is true. God does love you, and He wants you to exercise your agency to choose the gospel. Don't allow yourself to be buffeted about by the world, and just because you've always lived the gospel, so you're just going to kind of keep drifting in that direction. Actively choose the gospel, actively choose to participate in the gospel and to interact with the people around you. And they're not going to be perfect. None of us are, and you're not perfect. I'm not perfect. The people who are hearing this aren't perfect. Have the humility to recognize your imperfection while not hating yourself for it. That's something I've noticed a lot with my peers is they hate themselves for this element. Don't. You make mistakes. We all make mistakes. The atonement is to allow you to make mistakes while still moving forward with your eye single to the glory of God. Um, so do that. Make your agency, choose your or exercise your agency and choose the gospel while giving yourself the forgiveness to use the atonement to be cleansed of your sins and just to continue moving forward with using your agency as best you can.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. And again, I appreciate you coming on. I'm excited for people to hear this episode, your story, and then kind of our little extra nugget of knowledge towards the end on our opinions on things and whatnot. But again, truly appreciate you being on today, being open and being willing to share your story.